I just plant because I like the plants, and that's it. I just like plants. When I was at work, I couldn't do gardening very often. My hours of work were very difficult. But I used to have pots, containers, whatever I could get plants into and what time I had available. The dream was to always have a cottage with about 1 acre of garden. We all have these dreams, but I never thought mine would materialise, and it did. I used to see this cottage as I passed by before the hedge was so high, many years ago, and always liked the look of it. And when I found it had been restored and was livable in, this was the one for me when it came on the market.
In just 6 years, Leslie Holmes created this magnificent cottage garden from nothing.
What I try to achieve here is a mixture of the wild with the cultivars. Close, compact planting does give you a lot of help in keeping the weeds down, providing you've cleared a lot of the perennials beforehand.
Leslie's garden covers about 1 acre, but it's never possible to see more than a fraction of that at any one time.
I visualise, which I've produced here, lots of winding pathways, enabling you to come across certain plants which will hold your attention and cause you to go on looking. Because I feel if you could walk in a garden and you can see the whole effect straight away, half the interest is gone.
This garden is a perfect example of how to create more or less instant height, and that's what we'll be concentrating on in this programme. How to build the supporting structures, what plants to use, and how to plant them.
I wanted to create upward growth as much as possible, because all my previous gardens I've been living on the flat, as it were, and it's all very nice, but I feel if you can grow things upwards you get a much better effect, particularly in a flat area. And pergola, archways, bowers, pillars seem to do the trick.
Well, I've built pergolas out of rustic poles, only to find that they last probably a couple of years before they rot off. So you've got to be a bit careful about the materials, haven't you?
Yes, these are steam-treated posts. I don't know whether it's Cuprinol they treat them with, but one of the wood protectives. And they are spiked, ready. We put them into the ground about 18 inches, into a lot of rubble. No concrete has been used on any of them because it's very heavy clay anyway. And most of this area, and it's a 60-foot long pergola, were completed within the week.
Now, what about the roses? Have you used climbers or ramblers?
A mixture of climbers and ramblers, and not a few shrubs which behave like climbers. Again, I think because the garden is so tightly packed with plants that it's causing them to give extra growth.
That visit inspired me to go for instant height too. So when my demonstration artisan's garden was dug over, I started with the climbers. One of the great advantages with container-grown roses that you can plant them at any time of the year, but just note on this plant that this has been pruned back really quite hard. It may seem odd with a plant that you're trying to grow up high to actually prune it back hard in the first season, but it is the thing to do because you can see this lovely strong growth coming out, and that's going to produce a really strong and healthy rose. Now, the first thing to do is to give it a good watering. Even if it seems wet, every container-grown plant needs to go in really moist, otherwise those roots never seem to get out of the compost. We just allow that to drain away a little bit. That's fine, and then it can come out of the pot, and that can go into the hole. Now when you put it in, you want to plant it just slightly deeper than it grew on the nursery. So just use the cane that came with it just to check that it's at the right level. Planting it deeply encourages shoots to come up from the bottom. And then what we want is a bit of fertiliser. And that goes in just around the top of the soil here. Now what I do is just to chip a little bit of topsoil in around the plant, like that. Then you know you're getting the best of the topsoil in around the roots. And then gently firm with your boots. There's no need to set it in concrete, particularly if you've got heavy soil. And then the rest of the soil can go back on top. Now when this grows a little bit, these shoots will be tied into the horizontal wires to train them, and that's absolutely no problem at all. But when it comes to clematis, it's a completely different matter. Now they will climb by twining their leaf stalks around the support. So if you want the clematis to grow up the fence, you've got to provide some vertical wires as well as the horizontal ones. And you do that by twisting a bit of thinner wire up and down here around the horizontal wires. But if you're growing it next to a rose, there's no reason why you shouldn't use the rose to support the clematis. Pruning old climbing or rambling roses is quite different from pruning modern bush roses. John Scarman has a method which I must say was new to me.
The way it's pruned is twice during the summer. Just before it flowers, it will have great big long shoots coming out of it. And you immediately think, I can't cut these off because like a raspberry cane, it's next year's flowering wood. In actual fact, it doesn't quite work like that.
John has already pruned his superb rambler Bobby James, which covers his wall. But he used it to demonstrate the technique.
What we do is we cut off these shoots, and you can see here that this was actually 10 foot or so long. People don't like this because they assume that you're cutting off next year's flowering growth. But in reality, what you're doing is you're encouraging this very twiggy sort of growth. And all the energy of the rose goes into these little flowers, and they, all of them, develop.
So I see. So what you're really doing is growing the shape of the plant as a rambler to start with, to get it up there, and then treating the top like a shrub rose.
Exactly.
Well, this is a shrub. Now, it's much smaller, obviously, than the Bobby James, but is this at the right stage?
Yes, it is. You can prune these at any time, but we like to prune them now so that you get the nice shape, and it's quite straightforward. You're pruning for architecture. You haven't got time to look for the favourable outward-facing bud. It just simply isn't feasible. And with old shrub roses, it doesn't do them any harm at all. It's just a question of going for the shape. The whole idea is that you actually expose the flowers, which would otherwise be hidden by all this young growth. All the energy goes into the flowers, and you present the whole shrub, and indeed the garden, with a nice architectural feel about it.
Those lovely old-fashioned climbers and ramblers really are superb. But they do have perhaps the one snag that many of them will only flower once early in the season, with perhaps a few flowers a little bit later on afterwards. So in order to extend the period of colour, it's a good idea to grow through them another climber. This lovely old rambler, Alberic barbier, for example, produces a terrific flush of flowers early in the season, and with regular dead heading, a few more through the year too. To increase the flowering impact, I've grown a Clematis Étoile Violette through it. That gives me colour from July right through to late October. Of course, there are dozens of modern clematis that suit the cottage garden very well, many of them with large flowers, and many, like the Star of India there, with a very long flowering period. But if you're going to grow clematis through roses, you need something like the Viticellas or this one, Texensis Pagoda. The secret is to choose varieties that flower late in the year, and then when they finish flowering, you can cut them right down to within about a foot of the ground and pull all the old clematis stalks out of the rose, and that will give it a chance to ripen its buds, so it'll give you a really good show of flowers the following year, and of course the clematis will come back too. Well, though roses and clematis are certainly my favourite climbers, there are, of course, others too. Something like Solanum crispum is a real high-value climber because it'll go on producing these lovely purple flowers right the way through from June to November. If you look closely at the flowers, you can see that it's a relative of the potato, but in any beauty contest, this Solanum wins hands down. Of course, no cottage garden would be complete without honeysuckle. This is the variety Serratina, and it's pretty close to our native woodbine, which for me still has the most delicious perfume of them all. Of course, there's no need to restrict the planting to one species. Here I've grown a vine through sweet-scented summer-flowering jasmine. You can grow climbers through living structures too. The apple tree makes a perfect natural climbing frame for the rose. But cottage gardeners all have their own individual methods, and everywhere I visited I found different ideas. Pat, the rose-covered arch must be one of the most traditional features in a cottage garden, and you've got a lovely rustic one here. But the difference is this rope. What's the idea of that?
Well, the idea is that the roses will climb along it eventually, but it's taking a long time for them to get the idea. The roses have been there now for 6 years, and they're just beginning, as you can see, to go. But it is taking a long time.
And these are rambler roses, I assume,
they
are
are,
they?
yes,
which are a little bit more vigorous.
Yes.
Now, the rope is a black hemp rope. Did you actually treat it?
No, we didn't. We bought it like this from a ship, Chandler's, so presumably it is already treated.
It's going to make a lovely feature, actually, when it's done.
Well, I hope so, yeah.
If I see a brilliant idea, I have no qualms about copying it. So I did just that in my gentleman's garden. But in the artisan's garden, I had a completely different plan. When I built this little arbour, I decided that what I needed was something over the other side of the garden to really catch the eye, because that will increase the apparent length of the garden. And what fits the bill perfectly is a little obelisk. Now, I saw one of these in an upmarket garden centre and just copied it. And I made it for about 1/10 of their price. My one is made with roofing laths, which of course are already pressure treated with preservative when you buy them. It's very simple to make, really. They're just screwed together and held at the top with a piece of outdoor quality plywood. The only thing you have to remember is that these thinner battens on the inside must be nailed on before you put the whole thing together, because it's quite difficult to get a hammer inside there. And it's finished off with a little orb on the top, and that is the plastic ball from a lavatory cistern. Now, I wanted to create, as soon as possible, a great pyramid of colour and perfume here, so I've decided to use annual sweet peas. Now, I reckon that the old cottagers had the right idea about sweet peas because every one they grew was perfumed, and some of the modern varieties aren't. I don't think there's any point in growing sweet peas unless they're perfumed, so make sure when you buy the seed that your varieties are. I've raised them myself in my little cold frame, and I must admit that the work did catch up with me a little bit, so I'm a bit late planting them out, but still I potted them on and they'll be perfectly okay. Yes, they've got a jolly good root system there. And I've already put a bit of fertiliser in the soil. Now they'll need a little bit of help once they've reached the obelisk there, but I've just got to wait and leave them to grow on a little bit first. By midsummer, the obelisk was completely obscured by a cascade of sweetly smelling sweet peas. In my money-no-object gentleman's cottage garden, the climbers scramble up a beautiful trellis. It's made of hardwood, so I could concrete it directly into the ground without fear of rotting. It is expensive, but it should last a lifetime, just weathering to a lovely shade of soft grey. I've used my trellis to divide up the garden, and for the small plot it's the perfect way because it makes the division effectively, but because you can still see through it, it doesn't make the garden look smaller. And of course it takes up very little space. But if your garden is big, then it can sometimes be a positive advantage to divide it up into smaller areas. If you have the space, you can create living structure in the garden by dividing it with hedges. If it's a tall hedge you want, perhaps for a windbreak, then you could use closely clipped conifers. But if you only want a low-growing hedge, then Lonicera nitida will suit very well. If you keep this closely clipped, it will provide a very compact hedge, and look how well it contrasts with the more informal foliage of the copper beech. Then there's the traditional cottage garden mixed hedge.
It's a mixture of holly and hawthorn. Well, at least it was when we came. It's now got spindleberry and it's got honeysuckle in it and a bit of yew. And I'm waiting for some researcher to come and tell me that makes it 400 years old because it's got 4 different species in it. We decided that we'd extend the hedge there. So I went round the garden and found bird-sown seedlings of hawthorn and yew and holly and planted that, and that's now 4 foot high.
These are things that just appeared, really, in the garden.
There's a particular branch of a tree you can see they sit on to have a good old chat and possibly a snooze, and beneath that you'll find all sorts of seedlings. And I was pleased to find yew seedlings because I put that in the hedge and that will help to thicken it in the winter.
But if it's flowers you're after, you can't beat a rose hedge. I was particularly taken with this one at Cottage Garden Roses.
This is a lovely thing. It's Rosa complicata. It's from the Middle Ages. It's probably a hybrid between the Gallica and Rosa macrantha. Marvellous perfume. And it also has the most fantastic hips in the autumn. And again, we prune off this sort of growth just before it flowers, and again in the autumn to keep it like this.
Well, this is now about, what, 4 to 5 feet high. Will it get any bigger?
Oh yes, we want it to get up to about 6 or 7 feet, but the problem is if we let it get there all in one go, which it could quite easily do, it'll then start to fall over.
OK, so how do you prevent that?
Well, when you get the young plant from the nursery, it's been pruned, and that's your pruning height. Then after that, it flowers, and that's your flowering height. And you prune halfway between the flowering height and the pruning height. And you keep doing that and build the plant up slowly. This is quite a vigorous variety, and it's taken about 4 years to get here.
And the pruning you do in the winter?
Yes, but any time in the winter. Old roses don't mind.
And how long will it have these amazing flowers for?
About 6 weeks or so. And then they're followed in the autumn by these wonderful hips that you can see developing behind the flower there.
So, of course, the very last thing you should do is to deadhead these roses. And despite popular opinion, it doesn't take forever to grow a terrific hedge. The gentleman's cottage garden is beginning now to get a feeling of enclosure because the yew hedge that I planted last winter has put on quite a bit of growth. It's put on about 23 centimetres, that's 9 inches, in just 1 year. So perhaps yew is not quite as slow growing as you may have thought. Now I shan't do anything about trimming the top yet. What I'm going to do is to wait until it's got to about 9 inches higher than I eventually want it. And then I shall cut it back to 6 inches lower than I eventually want it. And that will enable it to make a nice bushy head so that I can cut a really clean top to it. But I do need to cut the sides of the hedge now, and it's not a bad idea in this case to just put a line out along the ground just to give you a rough idea of where you need to cut. Over the other side, where I've got all the plants, of course I can't do that, so I should just have to manage it by eye. But one of the great advantages a yew hedge has over plants like Leylandii, for example, is that it will grow out from old wood. So even if you make the most horrendous mistake, it will always grow out again. I've given it the best possible chance by reducing the competition from weeds and retaining moisture with this thick organic mulch. And I've also protected it from cold winter winds, which tend to scorch the foliage, by putting up this wattle fence. Now this went up when the hedge was planted, and it'll stay up for 1 more winter, by which time the hedge will be really well established and out of danger. This privet hedge is a wonderfully eccentric example of an old cottage garden tradition. An idea that cottage gardeners copied from the big house was the fashion for topiary. And these magnificent yew topiaries are at least 160 years old, and they more or less fill the small front garden of this little cottage. Mind you, the cottage is in the grounds of Haddon Hall in Derbyshire, and the boar's head and the peacock represent the coats of arms of previous owners. So it's quite likely that the steward who lived here was told to plant the yews here and train them in this shape. But there were plenty of cottage gardeners who did it just for fun, and indeed they still do. Now that's golden privet, George, isn't it?
Yes, that's what that is.
It's a lovely shape. Did you plant it?
Well, I expect I must have planted it in the first place, but I'd have been there a lot of years, you see, and I almost forget about it.
And did you actually decide on shaping it like that?
Well, yes, I cut it into that shape.
Yeah. What gave you the idea for that?
Don't know, it just come to me, I said, when I was a clipping of it, you see, and thought I'd make a little shape of it. Yes, that's...
So how often do you have to clip that?
I do it twice a year, anyway.
To find out more about cottage garden topiary, I went to visit Elizabeth Brainbridge at Langley Boxwood Nurseries. She started by showing me how to clip spirals.
You need a strong bush because you're going to cut a lot away from it. Shears and secateurs, and you walk around it a few times and take a few deep breaths. And what you're aiming for, to make it easy for yourself, is think of parallel curves downwards. Most right-handed people will do it in this direction. What I do is to start about here, making the parallel curves like that. A lot of walking around is involved, and you snip it just gently at first.
Now, a lot of the books suggest that you should put a bit of string or something around there to give you a guide, but you don't do that.
I don't, partly because we have a lot of these bushes to do, and you get better at doing it with practice. The nice thing about living sculptures, they are living, and they will grow again by the end of the season. So you don't have to be too terrified of making a mistake, and we all make mistakes. Now, very often with topiary, if it's not looking right, it's because you haven't actually been quite fierce enough. Proportion is everything too, but you can't get that right first time off.
And so you could say that by next season you will
Yes.
have that as a perfect spiral.
It'll be, yes, it'll be well clothed in foliage by next season, because again, we've cut a lot off. It will replace itself with a lot of shooting, a lot of new young shoots, and it should look pretty good.
Of course, there are many more exotic shapes, often illustrating the cottage gardener's traditional sense of humour. Many of these will have involved more than just clipping. With a couple of canes and ties, Elizabeth started to turn this bush into what will become a very respectable chicken.
Which are rather
It'll take clever clipping and another 6 months before it begins to look really good, but I began to see the shape straight away. Well, actually, that is beginning to look the part already, isn't it? I put 2 of these into my gentleman's cottage garden, and I found immense satisfaction in clipping my 2 roosters into shape. And these funny, formal structures do fit very well into the generally less disciplined feel of the traditional cottage garden. The cottage garden is essentially a place to be used, just as much as the cottage itself. And what better place on a sunny summer's day to sit and read or talk or just think than a lovely scented arbour like this. But of course, before the garden can be used, just like the cottage, it has to be furnished. Now, a gentleman cottage gardener may well go down to the garden centre, ancient credit card in hand, and simply buy it. But we artisans will still set to and make it and plant it ourselves. And that's for next week's programme.